All right. All right, I think we're live. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the second NYC HTML5 broadcast. Today I have with me our August speakers. We're actually recording this in February, so we're a little behind, but that's my fault. I will rectify that. So we have an IRC channel. If you want to pop in there, it's NYC HTML5 on IRC, or you can reach out to us through the group chat or through the website. We have NYCHTML5.com. And I am joined today by my fellow organizer, John Paul. Hi, John Paul.
Hello, everyone.
And our speakers, we have Corey, who spoke about HTTP.
Hello.
And we have Estella, who was kind of focusing on accessibility.
Hi.
And Cody with some SVG sprites.
Hello.
And Cameron on DSL, domain-specific language, right?
Domain-driven design.
Oh, that's what it was.
Yep, DDD. Hi.
Yeah.
Lots of D's, no S's and L's.
Yeah, totally. So let's go around the room and just if you guys could each share a little bit about what your talk was about and kind of give us the highlights, and we'll go from there. Maybe let's see, who should we start with? Maybe Corey?
Yeah, sure. So my talk was called HTTP by Hand, and I was sort of inspired to give the talk. I was debugging a Node Express app, and got a little frustrated trying to figure out what was going on, and dove down into the HTTP spec and just started learning a bunch of things that I hadn't really realized before, and got pretty excited about it and wanted to sort of play a little bit with it. And then as I learned more, I felt like I wanted to sort of share that knowledge with a bunch of people. So during the talk, I did some live typing of HTTP, emulating clients and servers, and showed how it's just a text protocol, and it's sort of very easy to understand if you read through the spec, and you can use it in a totally unmediated way. So that was sort of what my talk was about.
Cool. My plan was to go around the room and have each person talk about their talk. And then we'll jump back to that HTTP stuff. So let's go to Estella, and you can tell us a little bit.
Yeah, so my talk covered some easy ways to make common components accessible, primarily using ARIA attributes. The goal is to show how easy it is to build accessible components so that other developers can make accessibility part of the workflow.
Cool, which is super important. I think not enough people are focused on accessibility, which is a crime, I think, literally in some ways.
I agree.
So cool. And then SVG sprites with Cody?
Yeah. So my talk was essentially just sort of looking into the application of SVG sprites, mainly because there's a lot of misinformation going around about how to implement SVG sprites and exactly what they were. I was building a mapping utility at the time and needed a sort of a solution for sort of mapping together a few different SVGs. I started looking into this a little bit further. So it was pretty interesting to, I guess, dive further into learning about the history of the spec, and then also combining some newer practices to make the sprites. So I provided some demos that were very basic level, just how to implement them, how to use them, and yeah, that's all.
Cool. And last but not least, Triple D Cameron.
Yeah, so in my talk I was discussing domain-driven design, which is a discipline that has been used on the server for a long time now, and now that apps are becoming more complex on the front end, it's something that people can start using for that. And so I just started with some high level about how you can use domain-specific language to talk with business stakeholders and get requirements from that, and then got down to some of the building blocks of domain-driven design, like entities, value objects, aggregates, and repositories, and basically just use these terms as ways of modeling the real world within your code.
Cool. Yeah, there's a lot going on there, so we'll get back to that and dive in some more. I'm curious about the SVG sprite stuff. Maybe you could tell me more. Like, I mean, I've been doing web development for a long time, and I've never done an SVG sprite. I know image sprites and things like that, but is it becoming more and more common to do that, or is this kind of an edge thing? Or tell me more.
I think it's still kind of an edge thing. Before the talk, I was sort of looking around at a bunch of different websites to see what has been implemented and what had been prominent. That I found was everyone's still using, I think, icon fonts for a lot of different icons. Sites that are pretty icon heavy, like Medium.com uses a lot of icons. Different things like that. I was trying to find a few different examples of SVG sprites in use on sites, and I don't really see very much of that yet. I think it's still kind of an edge thing, but I think it'll sort of take off once people sort of. I think it definitely needs an adoption. I definitely think that it needs some sort of a method for it to be pushed over the edge before more people start using it. I think it's relatively simple once you figure it out, and if you're getting handed off, like images or different vectors from a designer, it's pretty easy to take those vectors that you've been given already in Illustrator and then implement them back into an SVG sprite for your own use fairly easily. So I think that depending on how the handoff goes, depending on I guess how a workflow within a company is, then I think that they have the potential to take off, but they're definitely taking a while.
So is the benefit primarily like minimizing requests, or what's kind of the driver for that?
Yeah, I think it minimizes requests. It also makes it pretty easy to edit the sprites live, I guess, via like a CSS animation or something like that, or if you need to change like a color or a vector within the SVG, you can do so via CSS rather than having to call a different icon within there. The other benefit to them is they're very easy to. Once you know your way around setting the view box within an SVG, I think they're very easy to sort of align within the frame versus having to deal with an icon font that also has a lot of different attributes like kerning and sizing and positioning. So this gives you the benefit of having the vector element, but also takes some of the complexity out of it. That you'd have within an icon font. It also works more seamlessly across more browsers, except for Internet Explorer.
It would be a little simpler to use too than like a sprite sheet, right? Because for the SVG sprites, you only need to like sort of reference them in your HTML. You don't have to do the CSS where you sort of like cut them out of a larger image. And
that was going to be a question I just had. So for someone who either watched the talk months ago, or it is not February, it's like the last day of August, or someone who has not experienced SVG sprites on their own, can you explain a little bit about what they are? From my perspective, for example, thinking about CSS animations in a regular sprite, it doesn't really make any sense in my head because of how you have to cut them out using CSS. What are SVG sprites in 30 seconds?
Yeah, absolutely. So an SVG sprite is basically one SVG file that just contains multiple vectors. So the vectors, when they're spit out from a program like Illustrator, the vectors for a different icon are separated within group tags. So anything that you say put in a folder in Illustrator would be spit out in an SVG within a group tag. So you could group those different vector, paths together when looking at the raw SVG file. So within those group tags, you can give it an ID and then call the different IDs from within an SVG using the use tag. So say you put the SVG file towards the head of your document, and this SVG file contains like two different vector elements, both with different IDs. Later in your document, you can use the SVG tag with a use and then referencing that ID, and it will call the different vector that you've had.
I see. Got it. So it is a way. It is.
Yeah, it's a little hard to.
Right in the sense that it is one image made of many, but
yeah.
They're individually referenceable by the spec itself, not some hack we do.
Right.
position.
So if you're looking at it visually, they're all stacked on top of each other also, and so you're just calling up the specific one that you need.
I see. Oh, that's why CSS animations work. Interesting.
Yeah, yeah. So it's a little difficult. If you look back at the talk, and there's a few slides in there that explain it a little bit better with some demonstrations. It's kind of hard to explain.
But that is clear. I get it. It is a way to combine multiple SVGs into one big XML file and then individually reference them elsewhere.
Yeah, that's
Got it.
That's
And do the SVGs need to be like in the document, or can you link to a file that has them all, or?
They can be external. Yeah, they can be external or internal, however you'd like to do it. I think externally you can use some amount of caching to cache the whole file, which is nice. Inline, I don't believe caching applies though.
Cool. Well, maybe that's even a good segue to the HTTP stuff, since we're talking about making requests and things like that. Do you think that Corey, that with HTTP2 that things will start to kind of change in terms of managing how many requests you make and such?
Yeah, I think it will. It's probably going to be a sort of a long changeover period. And it'll probably be sort of like an awkward phase too, where we try to support both styles, like HTTP1 style of like requests where we are optimizing to reduce round trips and stuff like that, and HTTP2 where we don't have to really think about that as much, and you can sort of optimize more for cacheability and sort of you basically want one request per object, and then your server can push those objects to you. You can minimize the requests by multiplexing that connection or opening multiple connections in parallel. That stuff is pretty well supported. Yeah, so some techniques like spriting could be a little bit harmful in HTTP2, but I mean I think they're going to be here for a long time because that changeover is going to take a while.
So why is it? So I am not a kind of person who has read any of these specs at all, but I vaguely understand it from gratefully talks like yours and just random Google or Twitter articles. I understand why it would be not helpful, but why would it be harmful to have spriting or like bundling requests together?
Right. So probably the primary way is just you sort of like the downside of having a big sprite file is that you are sending more data than you need potentially. Like if someone's not using all of those sprites, then sending them sprites that they never see is like wasted bandwidth. And then the other is like the cacheability. So if you've got like a giant sprite file with 100 images and one of them changes a little bit, you have to expire the cache for the entire giant file. And like when you can think about it more, when you can use HTTP2 and just like each request is sort of sufficient on its own, then you would just change the cache for a single request. Yeah.
So it's much more like streaming than it is like storing.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
I was also interested in the idea of sharding that you talked about, and I couldn't quite grasp it just from the talk. I was wondering if you could explain it a little bit more and maybe talk about why it's a poor practice.
Sure, yeah. So like originally I think whenever HTTP started sort of speccing out how to use the TCP connections underneath, the spec said like you should use 2 connections max to like parallelize your requests, and it's sort of grown. I think now you can use 6 to 8 or something, and browsers will even open many more. And so, well, actually no. So you would only end up with about 6 to 8 per domain in the browser, and that's just like the way they use their network queue. And so in order to get a bunch of images at once from a domain, the browser or the person crafting the HTML will use a bunch of different domains that all resolve to the same spot and sort of trick the browser into making like 100 requests at once to what ends up being the same server, even though the browser doesn't know. It sees like asset host 1 .domain.com, asset host 2, and so forth, and so you get a lot more data at once rather than waiting for it to finish each of its requests in turn.
Cool. Perfect.
And so we talked about requests and some of the sharding stuff, but are there other things that you think a developer should know about HTTP besides those? I mean, you kind of did a little bit of a deep dive and we're really like hand coding requests, but is that just sort of for fun, or do you think that there are more things that the common developer should be aware of?
Yeah, I think that was mostly for fun, just sort of like getting excited about the idea that it was even possible. Like, there are neat things that a text protocol allows you to do because you can sort of see everything happening and you don't need special tools to understand it. And so it's like, it sort of makes me a little sad that like HTTP2 is going to be binary. That won't be possible anymore.
But if that was the day-to-day of every developer, we would have a lot of very, very frustrated and annoyed people on our hands.
What was the beginning of that?
If every day, if dealing with HTTP was actually writing ASCII directly to Telnet, basically, this would not be good.
Yeah, totally. No, I mean, it's great that we have these abstractions that we can live upon, but it's also, it's like, it was sort of like really gratifying to see that, oh, at the base of it, it's like, it's actually sort of like a very simple protocol.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, but it's like, as far as what people need to like learn about the protocol, I mean, the good news is that you don't have to do anything special to, if you're like developing sites from the front end or the back end, really, you don't have to do anything special to take advantage of HTTP2. Well, from the front end especially, it depends on where you're working in the back end. Like your server has to support it. But beyond that, it's designed to be essentially backwards compatible. It doesn't change the semantics of HTTP. The same verbs are there and the same requests look the same. You still have headers and things like that. So it will all continue to work. But yeah, like for the reasons we sort of mentioned, especially like pipelining of multiple requests, some of the things, like the hacks that we've sort of done to trick the browser into reusing TCP connections, we don't have to do anymore. So there are a lot of ways to get speed improvements, but you don't have to do them. The same code will continue to work over the same connections and with the same servers when it's upgraded to HTTP2.
Do you think that there'll be different tools that are made prevalent in terms of like code concatenation and compilers?
Yeah, maybe. So code concatenation may sort of, I mean, I'm sure there's going to be like a bunch of tools that sort of like help people bridge the gap, because that'll be the hard part, where if you are serving to an HTTP1 client, you want to concat, minimize requests, like stuff everything together. But that's like sort of will be harmful for ways that we discussed for an HTTP2 client. So there'll probably be these like tools that bridge that gap and help you. If it's an HTTP2 client, it's just going to send all the requests, and it's going to like, it will proactively push down like the JavaScript and assets to them without waiting for the client to request it. But with HTTP1, you still have to like, you do it on a request by request.
I would assume that this is all already in the roadmap for Rails asset pipeline for somewhere in the next 5 years. Is this just in my head?
I don't know, actually. Yeah, it would be. It probably is. Like that would be the right place to sort of abstract that away, and I'm sure they could do a good job of it. Yeah.
Well, when is this stuff coming? I think in your talk you said that it should be finalized in the fall. We're now deep into the winter, literally.
Yeah. Well, the last Tuesday, so February 10th, 2015, they just put out draft 17 or version 17 of the spec, and it's like each successive revision has had the sort of like fewer comments, I think. So it's probably going to move from draft to proposed standard like really soon. I think I would imagine like this revision or the next. So.
I don't know what the right metric is here, but in addition to that, I think last week or sometime in the past 2 weeks, Chrome Canary, I believe, removed speedy support for only HTTP2 support.
Oh, really? Oh, I didn't know that.
I don't know what day this happened, but it was sometime recently.
Google definitely, like, because people had complaints about, they thought HTTP2 was basically just a Google project, so Chrome has announced they'll remove all speedy support eventually. The Chrome team has from Chrome, so it's like it's all going to be the actual standard. But yeah, that's cool if it's already.
I believe they just did that.
Awesome.
Very cool. And just real quickly, can small batch HTTP requests actually be considered artisanal?
Well, I'm from Williamsburg, so Like everything we do here is artisanal.
Yeah,
yeah, I don't know. That was just a for fun thing, I think. Yeah.
yeah. Cool. So let's move on to accessibility. Estella, I think I might have asked this in the talk, but like, who are we targeting when we're trying to make these ARIA improvements?
Anybody that, well, pretty much everyone. I mean, accessibility. You and I, a lot of us, we're all programmers, and we probably use our keyboard more than our mouse, or we try to. So, one way to test a website for accessibility is to see if you can tab through it. So it's really nice when you can just rely on your keyboard to navigate a website. But more importantly, people that are visually impaired, people who rely on tools like JAWS to navigate a website. And it could be somebody like that's even just colorblind. You don't have to be completely blind to require an accessible website.
Do you think that like people, I mean, non-handicapped people are, I guess specifically developers, are looking at things like iOS that has a lot of built-in support for that stuff and thinking it's not necessary? Do you think it's a concern that maybe not as many people are doing it?
Well, I think there's in places like Australia, I think that it's actually a requirement for your website to be accessible, and at any point in time, like the government can say, all websites have to be accessible. And I'm sure at some point too, there's gonna medical websites might have to be accessible, or public websites, government websites will have to be accessible. So it's something that's kind of always been in the back of my head, like, if at some point our audience changes, it's going to be a big pain to go back and make everything accessible. So you might as well just build it accessible from the beginning. Yeah,
for sure. And we have some laws here in the States, but I think they only apply to like
the government. Okay.
I remember when I worked at Sears that they had a freak out at one point that they may get sued because their site was not accessible enough. But I don't know if it still applies to big companies like that, or if it's just government related stuff.
Right. I'm not sure about that either.
And I think somebody asked about internationalization at the talk. I don't even know how you would handle that. I guess maybe it doesn't even apply because of the tags are what they are, and it just would work.
I think it would just work because like blurb.com, the website I work on, is translated into several different languages, and it all just works the same. I'm sure there might be some exceptions that I've overlooked, but I don't think internationalization is an issue. One question that someone did ask was about testing, and how can you? Unfortunately, I didn't look into it further, but how can you just build a website and then run your test suite and determine if it's accessible or not. Some things I've done is write unit tests for just checking for accessibility in dialogues, but that's all very manual. There isn't like a framework out there.
What is the checks? What are the verification steps for accessibility in dialogue, for example?
Well, one important thing is you have to be able to tab through the dialogue without.
Wow.
And while maintaining focus within the dialogue, because once you get focus outside of the dialogue, then you just get lost. And most dialogues, they have that overlay that that doesn't allow you to get back to the main content. So it's really easy to lose yourself in a page, or to lose focus. And for someone, if you're just working with the keyboard, it's you might have to tab through like thousands of links or hundreds of links to get back to your dialogue.
Yeah, especially.
I've done that actually. It has not been fun.
Yeah, especially if you're handicapped in some way, I could imagine that being like really frustrating. You might not even know where the heck you are if you've tabbed out of the form.
Right.
And can totally get lost. Did you? What sort of got you interested in accessibility? Or I remember you were talking about some components that you were working with. Was it just that you stumbled across it, or is there?
Well, I learned first about accessibility several years ago. I watched a video by Victor. I think his last name's pronounced Saran. He worked at Yahoo, and he did a video. He was visually impaired, and he did a walkthrough about what it's like to navigate the web using a tool like JAWS, and it's almost impossible when it's a non-accessible website. And right before I decided to do the talk, I was at Google I/O and I attended some sessions there, and it kind of dawned on me that ARIA actually makes it really easy to make a website accessible. So I just looked into it further, and then I decided to do the talk. And I feel like, at some point we all had to learn HTML and learn what attributes you need to use for each HTML tag, right? And ARIA attributes, they're just that, they're attributes. So I think all we need to do is just kind of get used to knowing what the attributes are. At some point, you kind of memorize these things. And once you know what you need to use, it's just easy to make it part of your workflow. But yeah, it was a Google I/O talks that I attended that kind of inspired the talk.
Yeah, I imagine once you get into your workflow, then that's kind of the first hurdle, and then it just, especially if you had like something in your testing suite, that would be really nice.
Right.
Do you see? I have a question about this because mainly I've been predominantly, I think as typically people have been, on the delinquent side with respect to accessibility. Sometimes there have been very explicit like keyboard accessibility requirements that were fairly straightforward to integrate because they were given outright. So what you just said was it's sort of like HTML and we learn these attributes. Do you see there being sometime in the future some tooling around giving us hints when we should be doing these things? For example, Sublime, or the typical text editor will say, you did something wrong, you forgot to do this. You have a form without a method, something like that.
Yeah, there should be. I hope. I mean, I have days where I'm like, I should do this. Build like a tool for Sublime that'll kind of tell you you're missing this, you're missing that.
Yeah.
But as far as I know right now, there isn't much out there, and I'm surprised that there isn't a bigger drive to do
Yeah, that's
things like
interesting. I wonder if I've done some work on JSCS, and I wonder if like some of those groups who I think are working more together now, JS Hint and ESLint and such, how much thought that they're putting into it, because that would be the perfect way to kind of incorporate that and just have the parser kind of go through and check for those sorts of things.
And the nice thing about accessibility too is that if your website's accessible, it's also very, it helps with usability as well. So kind of they go hand in hand.
Yeah, definitely. Cool. So let's switch gears now and maybe chat with Cameron about domain-driven design. I'm curious, what got you into it? What's kind of your background, and how'd you kind of get fascinated with it?
So I actually only started programming 3 years ago, and my first job, my manager just sat me down and said, and basically explained the architecture of the software that we were working on. Said these are all of the tiers that we're using, and he explained application, domain, data, and infrastructure layering, and talked a little bit about the entities that we were working with and stuff. And that just became my mode of thinking. And I thought it was great. And then it was just last year that I actually picked up Eric Evans's book and started reading. And when I did that, when I read the book, I think I got this fire of enthusiasm within me. I became very zealous about domain-driven design, and like this is going to be the cure-all for all all development problems ever. And I don't think it's that anymore after having to actually implement these concepts in projects. But I think it's an excellent tool, and just having the vocabulary to know what these kinds of objects are that we're talking about is useful for any developer.
Cameron, I just think you have to try a little harder. Panacea, just go for it. You'll never have. I have not had a bug in years since I read the first chapter of that book.
You know what? I believe it. I believe it. I do have to try harder.
Yeah, you do.
Imagine where you'll be once you read chapter 2.
I know. That's why I stopped. Joe, you described why I stopped reading the book. It was not because it's too complicated or boring, but only because I didn't want to be too good.
You didn't want to become a god.
Yeah.
I really like that part of it that it's domain-driven design where they talk about like a ubiquitous language, right?
Yeah.
Like everyone has to use the same terms for the same things.
That is the biggest takeaway for me from the first chapter.
I've been in so many projects where the programmers have a different name for the same concept that other people in the company use, and so it's like someone's talking about a stack, but like in the code it's implemented as an account, and it's like all this like this like mental shift that you have to make every time you like move from writing code to like talking to business people, and so I really was drawn to that particular part of it, like solidifying those terms.
Yeah, and I think that could be extremely helpful. Just shortly after I gave that talk, we started on a new project at my company, and we have 2 offices, one in Berlin and one in the United States, and I was really advocating hard for a certain directory structure that we should use for this project that's based on the multi-tier architecture, and it's really hard to express that across a language barrier, I think, and a lot of these different architectural things. So we didn't go with a lot of these, what I felt were very fundamental domain-driven concepts, but we did come up with a ubiquitous language, and I feel like we really gleaned 90% of the benefit of that methodology just from talking in the same terms.
Cool. And so, I mean, it seems like that's the sort of thing you would have to do with a greenfield project. I can't imagine a project already existing and trying to go back and enforce some of those things on it.
Yeah, well, I think it's Martin Fowler that said the definition of architecture is the things that are really hard to change later. So I think that's true.
Well, the book actually, I believe, does define ways to, with a hell of a lot of patience, address pieces of legacy that need to be either wrapped in new code or be slowly cleaned up and pockets of it pushed into new, better design. I forget the fancy words they use for this. It's either big ball of mud or spaghetti or accessible layer. I don't remember. There's so much jargon in this book. But there is a mechanism to address your question.
Yeah, I don't know if I can speak to that as much, but I'm sure it is true to make those gradual changes.
And so, are you? What is your role typically in these in the group? Are you like kind of managing the project, or are you acting as a developer, or what? Where do you think that should be driven from?
So I'm acting as a developer. I'm working on. I guess I'm the sole person working on a certain part of the front end for this project. And it's a very thick client, and so I guess a lot of these kind of decisions have to be made when you're dealing with that much complexity in the browser. But yeah, I'm not managing anything.
Cool.
Except complexity.
Boom.
One of the things that I was sort of like wary about with domain-driven design is that it seemed like a very dogmatic practice, like really regimented. Is that a correct assumption? And like, if so, are there bureaucratic parts of it that sort of get in the way of getting things done with it?
I think it really depends on how you go about doing it. If I had been managing a project back in August and I had been trying to implement these ideas, it would have been extremely dogmatic and religious, I think would be the way that I would describe it. But I think once you have a little bit of experience with it and you just understand the concepts, that a lot of them just become implicit in your code and the way that you separate out all of your concerns. And so it's not as much of a prescribed pattern to follow.
So I've had a very similar thought. So just so that I know lots of people who are obsessed, similar to Cameron in August, except this has been true for years. So it is things that they talk about when you're trying to talk about like how the weather is outside. And I have come to find that so have any of you read or heard of the book Getting Things Done?
Yeah, David Allen, right?
Yes. Okay. So I have a very similar thought about people who are obsessed with that book. There is a certain amount of religious dogma that comes from the people who love both domain-driven design and Getting Things Done by David Allen. And the reason behind this is not because these books are somehow cultish or that they foster a kind of religious devotion that is incorrect, but rather that because the percentage of what they get right is so high that people think, wow, I haven't seen a book that's this right before. It must be all right. I have to listen to everything. Whereas the average book is like 20% right. So you can make those trade-offs as not religious. John Paul's opinion. That is why I think people are like that.
And I can see like people naturally have this aversion if they're on the other end of it. You know, somebody's trying to drive this approach to the project, and I can see like a lot of natural just pushback from whether it's dogmatic or not. You know, have you experienced a lot of that in the project you've been working on?
Pushback specifically?
Yeah.
I don't think. I think that people pushed back initially to my dogmatic approach, but I don't think that people pushed back against the broader concepts of domain-driven design. So I don't think so.
Cool. Cool. Anybody else got anything on DDD? No? Cool. So maybe we'll wrap things up. I guess since we were just talking to you last, Cameron, maybe you could just give us some bullet points, some takeaway points from your talk, and we'll go around the room.
Yeah, I guess the main things are that when creating a project, it's best to start with real-world language and try to create a model that you can use in your code to build things around. And it's good to learn those basic building blocks of how to do that. But to do that, you probably just want to read Eric Evans's book.
Cool, cool. And maybe let's go with Cody, SVG sprites. What are some of your takeaway points?
Yeah, I guess that SVG sprites are really easy to implement and use. They provide a lot of support for cross-browser. They're easy to build fallbacks for Internet Explorer. There are a lot of tools that exist to help you create these and create the fallbacks for them. Grunt icon is one of them, and it goes in line in a grunt task and allows you to basically automate all of the SVG creation, SVG sprite creation. I think it's something that's fairly simple to use and fairly easy to understand once you get your head wrapped around it. And I hope to see more of it. I hope to see it become more prevalent in the coming months.
Cool. Yeah, it seems like if you have the tools, then things kind of really take off from there.
Yeah.
Cool. And so let's go to Corey with HTTP.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I guess my goal with the talk is really to inspire people to, don't be afraid to explore the specs for the tools that you use. Like lots of times they turn out to be, they're very like dense, and it's like prose written like code because it needs to be so specific. But it's also, I think, really enlightening and sort of fun to do. And as we were talking, I think I realized that John, you probably were like the genesis of this for me, because a few years back you were a consultant at a company that I was working at, and I remember you were sort of exhorting me to read.
All right.
Like I think it was like the grammar for some HTML5 APIs or something like that from the WTC.
I do.
That was like a mind-blowing experience, and so like the HTTP spec when I saw it sort of reminded me of the same thing. It's sort of, yeah.
When it's not directly related to your job, it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. I wouldn't want to do it for a living, but I'd love to be able to like dive into it and learn. Cool.
Yeah, it's at the core of a lot of what we do, so it makes sense. And Estella, accessibility?
I just want people to not feel intimidated by building accessible websites, and the goal of my talk was to show really how easy it is, and also to show that there are some tools to manually test these things.
Yeah, hopefully we'll have some built-in automated tools, some grunt tasks and gulp tasks and stuff, and that'll kind of push things along. That would be great. JP, you got any closing thoughts?
No, I don't think so. I learned a lot in this past 45 minutes. Thank you all so much. This is, I don't know, to have enough time in the day to Google for everything here, man, one day with a time machine.
Yeah, we're providing a lot of value here, so it's great. Yeah. Excellent. Yes, thanks to our guests here, and This is the August NYC HTML5 broadcast. You can find out more about us on NYCHTML5.com and in the IRC channel. And I don't know. Until next time. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Bye.
Cheers.